For the past several years, I've enjoyed travelling around various different parts of Australia. In 2004, I travelled along the west coast of Australia, from Perth, where I live, to Broome. And the reason that I mentioned that travel trip and that tour is that the group of travellers that I was with at the time, with the exception of one, after a few days' rest in Broome, were then going to travel through the Kimberleys in Western Australia from Broome to Darwin. So it was at that time that I thought, well, yeah, I'd like to do that holiday at some point myself. And then 2 years later, in 2006, I had saved up some money and had some annual leave due. And I decided that that's what I'd like to do, that I'd like to travel through the Kimberleys. So I went down to the local travel agent and sat down with a guy and started by saying, I'd like to travel through the Kimberleys. What can you tell me about them? Is there anything that I should see? And he said, well, do you like waterfalls? And do you like water? I said, yes. He said, then in that case, you really want to go to the Mitchell Plateau so that you can see the Mitchell Falls. And I said, that sounds good. Can we explore that option? He asked me, do you have any preference about how you travel and what the style you travel in? I said, yeah, I'd like to travel in a group tour of some sort and camping out overnight so that we could camp either in tents or under the stars in swags, as opposed to staying in cattle sheds or at hotels. The travel agent went to his shelves and brought back several brochures, and as we looked through them we found that there was really only one company that fit the criteria that I was looking for, a company called Travel About. The price seemed okay, and so I decided that I'd book a tour with them, and that was going to be in August. In early August, I flew up to Broome and stayed for a few days' holiday of relaxing. On the appointed day of the start of the tour, I got up early, packed my stuff, and then went out to the front of the hostel to wait for the bus to arrive. After about 10 minutes, a four-wheel drive truck with a bus cabin on the back of it, with Travel About emblazoned on the side of it, drove up. A short, stockily built, shaven-headed man wearing a crumpled slouch hat, khaki short-sleeved shirt, shorts and boots, jumped down from the driver's side and came around to me and said, "Are you Peter?" When I said yes, he stuck out his hand and with a firm and polite handshake introduced himself as Adrian. After checking the paperwork, Adrian packed my stuff into the top of the bus, opened the bus door and said, "Hop in." I clambered aboard and took the last remaining seat because it turned out I was the last one to be picked up. Over the next couple of days, Adrian proved to be a great tour guide. He kept the group really well informed about our different travel options. He really knew his stuff about the various different sites we visited. He was a really good cook, and he liked to have fun. On the second day, we were staying at Manning Gorge, and the highlight of that stay was a 4.5 kilometre hike over scorching rocks to the waterfalls at the gorge. And once we got there, Adrian was the first one in the water, the first one to swim across the pool, and clambered up the cliffs opposite us, and then proceeded to jump off the 16-metre high cliffs into the pool below. He was a good guide. I've previously said that the Kimberleys are extremely remote. News from the outside world takes a little while to get into it. It was on that second day, at Manning Gorge, that we learned that a German tourist had gone missing at the Mitchell Plateau. Now this was interesting to us because Adrian had discussed with the group that he had intended to travel onto Mitchell Plateau the next day, as opposed to the more normal advertised itinerary of going only about 2/3 of the way. Now, none of the tour group had any objections. We wouldn't have known any different anyway. So we woke early the next day and headed off. We stopped for lunch and supplies at the cattle station about halfway to the plateau, and then at about 3 p.m. we passed the advertised overnight stop. From there the road just got way rougher. As we drove, Adrian's usual banter from the front of the bus dropped off as he concentrated on driving. Nevertheless, it was a slow and bumpy ride. At about 5, we pulled into the campsite and noted that there was not much happening there. We unpacked and set up camp, and after a quick change into swimsuits, Adrian led us down to a small creek where we could swim and bathe the dust of the day off us. Then it was time for dinner. Some of the group, as usual, helped Adrian prepare the meal, while the rest of us read or relaxed. I can't recall what we had for dinner that evening, but after the dishes were done, we sat down around the campfire and started talking. After about half an hour or so, this rangely built man, probably in his 40s but maybe his 50s, wearing neat but bush-worn clothes and a Stetson hat, and carrying his camping stool over one shoulder and a pouch over the other, appeared out of the shadows and asked, directly to Adrian, "Mind if I join you?" Now this was a little bit unusual, but Australians are a fairly friendly mob, so Adrian welcomed him. The rest of us shuffled round a bit so that the stranger could find a place for his camping stool. He placed his stool down opposite Adrian and quietly joined the conversation by asking who and what we were. Conversation continued like this for a while before Adrian started relating one of his stories. Somebody had mentioned how they were a mechanic, and Adrian started telling us a story about how on a previous trip to the Mitchell Falls he had broken the axle of the trailer, and how whilst he was repairing the axle, the pulley system which he'd improvised started failing, and he could hear it and he had to madly scramble to get out from under the trailer. He was a lucky guy. At this point, the stranger spoke up, and it was about the first thing that he had said since he sat down. That reminds me of the time that I did the paint job over on my 1963 Lincoln Continental, the one with the suicide jaws. Man, it was difficult to get the jet black enough, but I got it eventually, and ooh-wee, was it fine. Man, did I have some fun times and some successes with that Continental. Someone in the group asked what the plans for the next couple of days were. One of the stops was to be the Bungle Bungles. Now that prompted Adrian to tell us how one of his toolmate guides had told his group of campers that because it was an Aboriginal sacred site, that no one was allowed to speak. Apparently the tour guide had had the shits with the constant nagging and bickering between the campers. So, to get some peace from it, he told them that it was against Aboriginal custom to speak. Now, of course this was a fallacy, but they were tourists. What would they know? Ha ha! That was a good one, Adrian, said the stranger. I think that guide was smart to keep them quiet. It is sometimes a smart thing to do to mislead someone, or maybe just to tell a little lie. It's like the time I lied to this Christopher guy. You see, I was sharing a house with a transvestite named Tim, and Tim's female alter ego was Tina. Tina had been out in the town the previous night and picked up this guy named Christopher. I'd seen them come in and this Christopher guy was wasted off his dial. I don't know how he was walking. Anyway, I left them to it, and in the morning Tim had to go to work and asked me to look in on Chris prior to leaving. I had done the laundry overnight and Tim had some shirts to go into his closet. When I dropped them into his room, I noticed that Christopher was awake. He was so shocked to see me. I think he thought I was Tina's boyfriend with the shirts. Now, I automatically lied to him. The poor guy had just had no idea what he'd been through last night, and I couldn't hurt his feelings. We all burst out laughing. Poor Christopher.